You're listening to the Goodman podcast, and today Raj and I are going to be focusing on AI ethics and bias mitigation. And this is important because we need to ensure that AI systems are fair, transparent, and free of harmful biases. Now, Raj, we've discussed before we've touched on ethical AI, but perhaps you can just remind us what algorithmic bias is and why it is actually such an issue. Because people are worried that, AI is this, it's going to become sentient and all that kind of thing. And while that's still kind of science fiction at this stage, one of the big kind of almost hidden issues in AI is the fact that it's potentially perpetuating biases that we as humans, have. So yeah, maybe just let us know the overview of algorithmic bias, and we'll dive in from there.
Yeah. So, Megan, a lot of times we look at AI. We look at AI for guidance, for example, in problem solving, English responses. We want it to be unbiased, to be driven by our prompts, our insights, our thoughts, and give us a true representation of what the fact is. We can't allow it to be biased. For example, if we're making images, cannot have one race having more images of them. When you say, make me two human beings and a dog, it can't just be the same. It can't be the same breed of a dog, for example, every time. It can't be the same race of the human beings every time. It has to vary quite a bit to be able to be holistic about its approach. And that's important because if we're looking at AI to solve problems, we need to know that it can give us a true version of the answer every time. But what's happened is that because of unfair or uneven amount of samples being entered to train the AI, it is trained to be biased towards one side or the other. There's political biases, for example, or cultural biases, or representation of images, for example. It has a bias naturally. And so we have to make sure that when we're training the AI, that it actually is trained fairly, that it has a understanding of the political, cultural, ethical, all that sort of different things as baked into it as part of it. And what's interesting is that there are ways to check that these samples we enter training are neutral. So they are fair, that they represent a diverse section. That's one. Number two, we can check also the responses of the AI is fair and it's neutral and it's fair in terms of the different context of politics, policies, that sort of stuff. And so knowing this, knowing that we can check the input and the output, we can constantly keep training the AI to become more unbiased and be able to be more fair. It takes time. It takes a lot of sample. And famously, one of my friends, he was given, I won't mention the company, but a big organization which works in AI approached them, and they asked him for several pictures of hands. So hands, from pretty much people from all across the world, different continents, um, different altitudes, different complexions, just to be able to train the AI to know how a hand looks like and how, when I'm asking it to make a someone who's, say, American, American could be any shade, any color, any size, big, small, all that sort of stuff. So be able to provide the right context of the hand, and train the hand not having 6 fingers, not having 3 thumbs, all that sort of stuff, right? So all these things are important to be trained properly. If it wasn't trained properly, you have to keep training all the time. It gets to a level where it's actually totally unbiased, to give us a proper image, proper proper writing, proper voice, or where else we might require from it.
Yeah. Now, training is one thing, and I mean that's where everything starts in terms of ensuring that there's a diverse metrics in the training data, and we'll dive into that in a moment. But let's flip to the other side of the process, which is once it's been trained and you start getting these outputs, and you start seeing maybe something is not so right here with these outputs. So how do systematic algorithmic audits help in detecting biases within these AI decision-making processes? You know, how involved are humans in this process? Because we are inherently biased, even the best of us are. But you can't necessarily entrust bias detection to an algorithm because it's being programmed by a human. So maybe you can kind of walk us through an audit and how it works, how humans are involved, how the AI is involved, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to auditing, one thing I talked about is the overview of the content which is received from the output of the AI. I can actually audit that. That's actually a very good way to understand if the AI is fair, unfair, biased, unbiased. That's an easy way to analyze. Another thing you can do is data analysis of the inputs as well and the outputs, as well as the algorithmic design as well. So what happens there is that you can go through the flow of checks you have in place within the AI for it to be able to take out biases. So for instance, now if you enter into ChatGPT, anything which is like um, obviously extreme, visually extreme, or just extreme in any form, it will not talk about it, or it will say this data cannot be revealed to you, or I can't talk about this thing, for example. So it already has checks in place. So it has the ability to kind of figure out, is that output unfair? Right? Let me put a check there to say that information will never be revealed to the end user. But the algorithm itself can be audited to make sure that it's working properly. The data analysis part has to happen constantly. Mostly it can be done using AI itself. And that's the beauty of AI. You can actually build more AI using existing AI. And that's the reason why it grows so fast and it grows exponentially, because you have the AI right now analyzing
Mm,
other new AI being built and say, hey, is this data accurate? Is this biased? Is this unbiased? And then you can go to the workflow inside the tool and say, hey, this is the workflow of the tool. Does it look okay to you? Can we make it better?
mm,
You might have opinions. At the end of the day, there is a human in the loop always there. A human being always checking to make sure that it makes sense. But a lot of the heavy lifting is done by AI itself. And so that's the beauty of it. This way we can build
mm,
stuff
mm.
faster, because now we have tools to check the other tools you're building. And you can make it much rapid prototyping, rapid testing, rapid deployment as well.
Awesome. Now, that's obviously essentially a quality control once the model's been programmed or trained. But now let's flip back to the front end of that training. So you obviously, in order to try and avoid any kind of bias, you need to have a very diverse data training set. But the data training sets are often collated by a human, and a lot of our biases are unconscious. And I think one of the very famous cases with these algorithmic unconscious biases is the case of facial recognition, where they had a higher accuracy rate on white male and a very low accuracy rate on black female, because the people programming it were majority white male. And so that's what they were kind of, that's where their mindset was. And it wasn't intentional, but it was something that was an oversight. So what approaches are being developed to ensure that data sets are representative and unbiased right from the word go?
Interesting, this thing. Actually, let me say something which is a little bit not super relevant to AI, but just kind of showcases in human beings. I
Mm,
read somewhere that we are able to to recognize people of our own race better, people of a different race. So, often you hear this kind of, again, I don't want to use different sort of segregate people based on their ethnicity, but they often you say somebody from a different ethnicity, they all look the same. They all look the same. All these guys look exactly the same. And obviously, that's not true, and it's because we can recognize our ethnicity better than somebody else's ethnicity, and that's why when you look at passport control people who are sitting on the border control, for example, they also like to train really well amongst with different ethnicities in place so they can recognize fakes and potential malpractices as well. So that's the context, right? Now think about, let's go into AI and let's look at AI. So again, if we are training AI with more white male, as you were saying earlier, it'll recognize them better as compared to, as you mentioned, black females. So what do you do to overcome this? Well, the underrepresented groups are oversampled. So you oversample them to compensate for the lack of the content around them, to train it, make it better. It's the same practice we deploy in real life that we deploy in AI. In the case of border control officers, we train them on other ethnicities to kind of understand and recognize them. And what to do with AI, exactly the same thing. You overcompensate by having oversampling particular ethnicities to make up for it. And that's how you kind of allow it to, gain more balance or fairness. But it's not easy. I mean, this is, to find sample data of that level and that nature is hard. Imagine like you're looking to find 100,000 no's, for example, 10,000 different eye structures, for example. You're looking to find 10,000 different ways of saying I care in English, for example, then in Spanish, then in Arabic, then in Farsi. It's a time consuming, cumbersome job. And if you don't get it right in the first step, it's because it is very difficult to collect that data in the first place. And then make sure that data which you have is sufficient to do the job for us. So again, all these things happen for a reason, and the reason stems from the idea that really it's a costly, time-consuming challenge to collect the data information in front of us. If we have that, I think we will have a much fairer content tool. But to help with this, there's also a thing called synthetic data. And that is again, as I mentioned before, AI helps to build more AI. And that is the way the market is going. You can create some data using AI and you can get some data real world, mix up together, and you have the perfect combination.
Now, synthetic data, that's a very interesting topic, and it's probably, we don't have enough time to discuss it here, but maybe we must actually look at doing an episode on synthetic data, and we can have a look at that in more detail, because that's a very fascinating thing that's got wide-ranging implications for analytics and all kinds of things, not just with the bias.
Absolutely. I think this is, I mean, when I first discovered that this was possible at scale, I was just imagining to myself, like, now you find, like, to build better prompts. Let me explain a prompt which one we can build. For example, if you want to understand how often a challenge happens, let me give you an example. How many times does one crash a car when they drive from Joburg to Cape Town, for example, right? If you get an average data, it means nothing, because so let me make up a scenario and ask AI to give me, out of 100, how often does it happen? That gives me a better context of data. I can also give it more data around, well, if the person is sleepy and then drives, or is under influence of alcohol and drives, so I can get better context of things. That basically means that I can really understand the data in a sense that it can consume. because averages and means are great, but not really. It doesn't make a lot of sense for most human beings. If you break a sample down to out of 100, and you get the context for every piece of content, that's impressive. And
mm,
that for me is a great use case of synthetic data. You can actually use data created in the lab to represent the typical outcome of a scenario. Whether it's driving,
mm,
whether it is, people getting obese, for example, you name it. You can use it for any context,
mm,
for example, and let AI come up with the answer. Even though its own training, it can make up data which represents the reality of the matter. Without having to go and survey 100 people in, say, London, for example. It will cost us at least $10 or £10 per person minimum. And if it's,
mm.
they're hard to reach, it'll be even more expensive. Suddenly that's all broken down. So let's prepare this data, use it for our own purposes, which is phenomenal. Nice.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic thing, and one of the, I think, the great achievements of the current set of AI that we've got right now. But now you've mentioned, that by creating synthetic data, you're kind of giving it this context. So maybe can you just dive into the role of this contextual data and analysis in achieving fairness across demographic groups within AI systems? Because flipping back to the bias issue that we were chatting about earlier, does context, I would imagine it does have a fairly large impact on that particular issue.
Yes, and as I mentioned before, Megan, that AI with this current training in ChatGPT and Google and they have actually understood, they have actually built in using NLP, natural language processing, as well as deep learning. They've understood how to explain the context to the AI. So that it understands that by default out of the box. That
Mm,
implies that we don't have to think about these things anymore. That it just works from out of the box. That's very powerful because suddenly we don't have to every time make sure that every prompt we write is detailed. We can just give it very, single line, double lines prompts and it can do the job. Imagine a time when this was not possible. At that time, you had to write prompts which were a paragraph, two paragraphs, maybe even a page long to be able to give it, understand this context, for example. But now it gets it. As we go further, it will be able to do it will explain the context and ask the clarifying questions. If you look at the tools like ChatGPT now, it's starting to actually ask clarifying questions to make sure that it really understands the context better. This is a new
mm,
improvement in the last few days, and it will happen more and more so. A bit like human beings. If you're unclear about an instruction, you go ask the question. And that's what's important because as we go into the area of explainable AI, XAI, it needs to be able
mm,
to explain to us why it came with the answer. So it needs to understand the context itself to be able to give a deep dive into how it comes up with the answers. And all this stuff is very exciting and interesting. But I can say
mm.
for sure that AI understands context really well. I've been doing a lot of experiments with AI, and every prompt I write, it's able to pretty much get there. It does still go off track. That's a very it happens on very rare occasions, not as frequently as it used to happen, say 1 year back.
Now, if we're looking at, we've been speaking about the algorithmic bias, obviously, but while it's all kind of being worked on in the back end, it currently can have real world impact. So, what methods are being created to assess the real world impact of biases in AI? And are they actually going to help in mitigating potential harm that AI could create, like I say, in the real world?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the answers are the same. It's checking, we're looking at the output first and seeing is there bias in the output? And if there is, then it's working its way backwards to saying where is the problem? Is the problem with the algorithm itself? And then we'll look at the algorithm piece and give idea. It would then look at the well, what was it trained on? look at that and see if there was any bias in that, for instance. If there was a bias in the training itself, then it will say, hey, I suggest you overcompensate for the bias by giving it more context or by giving it more samples. And that's the kind of thing it can do to really help it less biases. But a lot of this, it actually, what impacts the whole thing is the output. If the output is incorrect, it analyzes that and then goes backwards. But also from new algorithms or new AI, I would say start with the input itself. Analyze the input first. Is this input you're entering fair and diverse? If it's not, the AI will tell you and say, hey, this area is a little bit lacking, for example, get more of this sample, for example. Then you can, when you have that information with you, and you input that in, it will tend to be more balanced. Again, no guarantees. AI does stuff which no one can, put the finger on it. But overall, this is a good practice to have. And the more we do it in that way, the more we will get more fair, ethical AI.
Yeah. And that's, we need a fair, ethical society. And so we need the AI to kind of align with that overarching goal as well. This has been super interesting, a little longer than what we normally chat. But yeah, thanks, Raj, for taking the time to chat with us about this. And thank you to the listeners and the viewers for joining us on the Goodman podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you found this interesting, don't forget to share it. And yeah, until next time, thanks, Raj. We'll see you around.
Thank you very much, Megan, and speak soon.